Hello, this is a surviving work conversation about possibly team working in health and social care. And to help us think about that, we have Clive Morton and Antonia Maclean. And we're going to start off with what may feel like a tangential question, which is to just look at this Buurtzorg model. So as you probably know, Buurtzorg is a Dutch company which delivers social care, and it's had a lot of press and interest in the UK over the last few months because it appears to offer quite a radical and positive model for social care, which is a sector that's pretty much in crisis in the UK as we're filming. So Buurtzorg apparently can deliver very high quality care at 65% of the cost, general cost in the Netherlands. It employs apparently 60% of Dutch community nurses. It's a community-based model, team-working based model. And there is apparently a much lower demand on the services of the social carers. So apparently 30 to 40% less time spent with patients, although those patients have a much stronger control over how and when they see these carers. So it's caused a lot of excitement, not least because the NHS and healthcare has to show massive billions of pounds worth of efficiency savings over the next few years. So we're going to try and unpack this model and pull out what we think is interesting and potentially useful for you as health and social care workers. I should also just say that both Antonia and Clive come originally from the manufacturing sector, although have worked with health and social care organisations. So we're also thinking about how different management techniques from different sectors can be used to help health and social care workers. So the first question is really, what did you think? What were your initial reactions to Buurtzorg model?
After you.
I really liked the case studies that I read about it. It's quite radical in the sense that it unseats the notion of highly split up working and instead makes a single person responsible for all aspects of the care role with the cared for person. So it's not, so instead of the cared for person having lots of small visits of different people looking after aspects of their care, you have one highly skilled person who is a nurse by background training, but who is actually doing tasks that are both the nursing tasks and tasks that are outside of the scope of general nursing. The team element of it is great because it's the way that they set up the work, which is, thoughtful in the sense that the case study I read is they put 12 people together, 12 nurses together in the team. They are being developed for a certain geography, a certain patch. So you've got a number of components immediately in place. One, you've got a bunch of people able to support each other within that particular community. And secondly, for all the practical problems of, where people are on holiday or are unable to see their person for that particular day, then there's good interchange between the work group of 12. It made lots of sense. And when we're talking about efficiency savings, we should be thinking about better service at less cost. And I could quite imagine how this would deliver that. Really, really impressive.
Yeah, I echo your analysis. I think it's a very interesting model, and the particular thing I'd like to pick out of it is it brings responsibility back to the individual. And not just responsibility, control as well, because that individual is making judgments, as you say, from a good skill-based point of view, but judgments about the whole person. Not, that person needs occupational therapy, and also, yes, we ought to involve a psychologist as well, or whatever. And maybe further down the line, that sort of a judgment may be needed. But the essential element is that individual is being treated as a whole person. The individual is allowed as a patient to influence, clearly from the case studies. The individual carer can take responsibility for quality and actually moderate what is happening without reference to anybody else. Because where we run into additional costs is where things get kicked up through a hierarchy for someone else to judge who is remote by some strange rationale that somebody remote is going to be better able to judge than somebody on the ground, which is rubbish.
Yeah.
So
by which times Mrs. Miggins has fallen over and broken her leg.
Absolutely.
And has been dispatched.
And I think you'll find also from the studies, parallel studies to this, that the individuals that you're talking about, the carers, get a great deal more satisfaction, job satisfaction, which of course is directly linked to the actual outcomes. So you get good outcomes. You get individuals who are motivated about their task rather than being told from above what targets or what procedures or anything else they've got to do, or being limited in where they go because of some professional or silo mentality that tells them they can't go over a borderline. So basically I think it ticks an awful lot of boxes. Now, it's clearly in community care. We need to look at different models for hospital care, based care.
Yeah.
So there are a number of themes that I want us to pick up on the discussion. So one of them is about the phenomenon of silos, or sort of very broken down job roles, which is a real problem. And sort of in the employment relations literature, we understand this as a Taylorist or Fordist model, this idea that you break tasks down onto the conveyor line so that you get efficiency that way. And one of the arguments in certainly health and social care, also in education, is that in order to innovate, which is required for cost savings, if you're going to save money, unless you're just going to sack everybody or stop providing certain services, you are reliant on the people that are on the front line to find ways to innovate.
Exactly.
And how do you do that? Well, then we can turn to the learning literature about how do we learn anything? How do we learn to do things better and well? And one of the problems in health and social care has been about the sort of way that job roles have been very sort of clearly demarcated.
You see, there is a paradox here, isn't there? Which is the splitting up of the work task actually means that you are likely to end up with something that is less productive. So higher cost, lower service, lower quality, The other side of that, though, is the importance of having people who have joined a profession, have wanted to be a nurse or wanted to be a psychologist or wanted to be a mental health specialist. So people who've got a deep knowledge of their area. And now, in order to provide whole person care, and you just referred to hospitals, Clive, and I'm just thinking, for example, we now hear about the cancer team meeting, once a week to review the caseload, and you want to have a bunch of specialists on the single task. So you don't want silo mentality, but you do want the people with the ability to bring together expertises.
Well, that's where I think you need to build that into the work situation. If I can give a manufacturing example, if I go back to a Japanese manufacturer, Komatsu, where I helped them set up a factory in the northeast back in the late 80s. We had loads and loads of visitors to the factory because of what we were doing and what we were achieving through the shop floor workforce. And people used to say to me, your folk must be very empowered. And I said, no, they're not empowered at all. They have a very, very tight system to operate. They cannot deviate from that system. They must follow that in precise terms as it's actually worked out as the best way of doing something. However, we do ask them and encourage them to stop and reflect, and in their breaks and in time that they're given for quality circles, to think, if you like, horizontally rather than the vertical prescribed approach. To think, hang on a minute, could we do that a bit better? Is there something we could do in a different way? And those sort of transformation questions really did provoke some interesting change. Some of it not world-shattering, but it's the point of incremental improvement all the time. And then the satisfaction that individual gets from saying, wow, well, I put that idea forward and we're now doing that. And that sort of thing. And equally with surgeons who you're quite right, would argue, look, we've got to be in the Kalman doctrine of having X number per year on this particular procedure, otherwise we don't actually get it dead right. They then are encouraged to take reflective time collectively and say, okay, what's the results of this? And when we see the dreadful things that have happened sometimes, and they are small in relation to the whole. Take the Bristol Infirmary, baby cases. There was no reflective time. There was no proper analysis of how did we do, and what can we actually do to improve. So you're right, it's a paradox, but it's also about taking that situation where people, yes, recognise something prescribed, but can also alter it by their own intelligence and will.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? That's unpacking it a bit, because the other thing about the Buurtzorg example model is that apparently it's a return to 1980s Japanese production methods, which were then used in nursing at that time, introduced in nursing, and the model was of quality teams or quality circles. So perhaps you could just explain to us a little bit about that model, about how it works, because I don't think I was quite so clear that there is this kind of paradox that the task is very clearly defined, but it's one of the questions is who it's defined by and how those discussions take place.
Yes, that probably gets a bit lost in the mists of time because it's such an iterative process of bashing out on the anvil, so to speak. But I believe it really goes back to a philosophical approach. And there were two quality statisticians, Americans, Deming and Duran, who were sent by the Americans to Japanese industry after the war.
Such an irony.
Yes, an irony. I mean, the Americans didn't actually take any notice of what these two were saying.
That's comforting.
That's right.
But the Japanese did.
But the Japanese did, because actually, America's position was that they were in the middle of a Korean War. They needed Japan to produce armaments, and their factories were incapable of doing so. So Deming and Duran were sent to try and improve those sorts of production methods. Japanese post-war situation, knowing they had to really do something remarkable to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, really lapped up this. Because what they discovered it wasn't just a method, it was a philosophy. And the philosophy was against Taylorism, it was against Fordism, because it said, look, you put the responsibility back to the individual. Forget those white-coated supervisors. They cost you money and they just breathe down people's necks. Just make sure that the individual's got the opportunity of getting it right first time. So and you will find in loads of academic papers that's a cycle. I can't remember the exact one I came across last week, but it's exactly a copy of Deming's cycle, which is plan, do, check, action. Very simple. You plan what you're going to do, you do it, you then check, did it work? And then if it didn't work or could be improved, you put that into process. So it's that continual cycle which you then get individuals to adopt, teams to adopt, managers to adopt, so that there is no difference. And you also get people to work together. For instance, in Komatsu, instead of a sequential approach on design, we developed a process where each team worked cross-functionally as design happened, which is totally against the traditional Western approach to how you develop design. We believe in putting people in an ivory tower. Hey, you go and think through this new product and develop it. You know, like a car design. Oh, come on, we'll have a wonderful new shape for next year. But there, the principle was, hang on a minute, we do this alongside production, we do this alongside procurement, so that then develops in a quality way, where rather than some supporting of an individual ego of saying, well, we have this wonderful designer and they're going to produce it on their own. I think I've said enough.
Yeah, but with some great bonus prizes, big side benefits, because then what you've got is a workforce that got some skin in the game. They've got some sense of ownership and responsibility for what's going on. And they believe that when they, having been given an opportunity to take part in the process of development, they are going to be heard and taken notice of. So
that's right.
And it's just think about it from a mental health perspective. Again, it's a win-win situation. What do we know about learning, innovation? The Gittell literature says, we have to have an open, transparent, communicative environment in order for people to learn and exchange experience. That's in the grown-up world. We're not in school where somebody tells us what to think. But also in terms of learning being very important aspect to our own resilience. What's happening to a lot of people working in these very sort of siloed jobs is that they're actually getting de-skilled. And also if you're on if you're an agency worker, you're very unlikely to be able to keep up with your training. So the issues around learning are very important, both professionally in terms of your capacity at work, but also in terms of mental health, not feeling defunct.
It wasn't long after that, I don't know, maybe a decade, that we then saw business process re-engineering come in. And now it feels like we're in the era of project management, program management, and and if you've got
the fashion,
if you've got Prince 2, you're going places. So what is curious is people, you described it as a philosophy, okay? Now, the word philosophy in my mind is love of knowledge. Is that right? Have I got the definition of philosophy right? Okay. So is something deeply humane about what Deming and Duran developed, but they didn't advertise it. They didn't advertise their ideas with big banners about sort of, social development and people welfare and how to keep people's mental health okay. Now, in hindsight, that might have been a mistake actually, because as those ideas have kind of developed on, we now come to the world of project management and program management. We have boiled things up to an extent that they don't seem to be about people anymore.
No, that's right.
You're also subcontracting to somebody else, aren't you? It's like having the old work-study department or something, where, these people are the experts at the production there, so we'll leave them to it. And that's rubbish, because until you get staff into something like, and this is where it comes to administrative staff and other areas, into a brown paper exercise where they can actually describe the process that's going on. They won't stumble over the fact that, hang on a minute, that's not very efficient.
So we're now seeing, it's been going, I think, for about a year probably, but these great programmes which are about which the government has put this Better Care Together fund together for, which I think is partly recycled money and partly new money. And the idea behind that is to reconfigure services that lie between hospitals, community and social care, so that those services are run more effectively but by completely different agencies, through completely different agencies. And so that there is the opportunity through that programme to do some really radical thinking and get groups that are funded and have very different philosophies and ideas about how to do things, to do things better together. And then you get this, the one that I've been looking at, you then look at what does it look like now, and it's turned into program management. It's turned into, it looks like, lots of well-trained people in terms of the, trained in project management type skills. and the meetings are a review, can potentially just become a review of Gantt charts and actions. And that we've now lost the stuff that was in the philosophy approach. People finding out how to do things better together.
Yes. So how to do things better together. So this is an important aspect of, again, the Buurtzorg model, which is about what's actually happening when they're talking about team building. Because one of the sort of problems with setting up an innovative group where people are exchanging ideas is that certainly in health and social care, they're working within a culture of bullying and fear, and most people shut up. They withdraw. Even if they attend staff meetings, they certainly don't say anything contentious, partly because the first stage of getting a realistic picture of what's going wrong has become a very toxic conversation. Also, because people are working in silos, they're not used to talking to each other. They're certainly not used to disagreeing with each other, which is highly likely to happen, isn't it? Because there's huge conflicts of interest, certainly between clinicians and the finance people. And that's a huge tension which works right throughout the system. So I want us to think a little bit about the philosophy of team building that we're talking about, because even if we can get to the stage where the individual feels able to responsibly have autonomous working, they've still got to navigate the team. They can't do that on their own. That requires, in addition, a very difficult task of being able to talk to the people around you sufficiently so that you can improve things. So let's think about different models of team building that this Buurtzorg philosophy might be in favour of.
Well, I mean, I think a starting point needs to be, and I get this really from my experience of working with the Japanese, is that we in this country and in the West generally are extraordinarily focused on the individual. We are very individualistic in our approaches, and we actually don't realise how negative this can be, actually. So to get people to work in teams is a task in itself.
Yes.
And I have a little homespun philosophy that the cleverer they are, the more difficult it is.
You're amongst friends here.
I once had a responsibility for looking after HR in an R&D company, and it was stuffed full of PhDs and other such academically qualified folk. Yes, and I've got a PhD myself, so I recognise it. And the problem is, and as you know only too well from your own experience, to get through that process, you are on your own. You have got to do it on your own. You're not doing it with anybody else. You're okay, you might have a bit of help and mentoring and so on, but you're on your own. So your formative experience of that level of education has been very self-reliant. And so you put then that bunch of people into a team and say, now come on guys, you're all going to work together.
Play with the other children.
This is extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah.
And so my starting point is to say, culturally we're pushing water uphill here.
Okay.
Because from the Japanese point of view, they naturally work in groups, and they have an incredible, I mean, we think it's a bit odd and a bit unnatural, but my experience of working with a Japanese company is that, particularly in Japan, the members of a team do not go home until the others have all finished, right? Until those tasks are finished. Their allegiance to the team, as it were, is extraordinarily strong. So having accepted that, we need to say, well, okay, how can we get this bunch of individuals who are very independent to work together? And I believe very firmly it's about getting those individuals to recognise the contributions of the others.
Okay.
And the overall task of the team.
Okay, I'm just going to say something about the Buurtzorg example and then open this up.
Right.
What we can do in our specific cultural context to build this sense of team. Because the Buurtzorg example, looking at it again from an employment relations perspective, it's in the Netherlands, and which has a totally different system of work, how work is organised and structured. The nature of the work isn't so different, but they have an egalitarian system, so there's less disparity, much less hierarchy, both informally and formally and financially. So the big hierarchical splits between clinicians and anaesthetists and nurses and midwives, and then the people that administer all of that, doesn't exist to such an extreme degree, which again makes it much easier for them to talk to each other, like as if we're all human beings rather than functions. The other thing to say is that it's got one of the most advanced welfare systems in the world, not quite as good as Sweden and Denmark, but on the road there, which means that people have a much higher social wage, they're much more protected, so they're more secure. What does that mean? Very crude terms, they're less anxious people. They're less worried about losing their job if they say something is going wrong. There's much more labour protections, much more wage protections. And we don't have that luxury at this point in health and social care. So I'm just pointing out the differences between the different contexts where these models have to operate. So, very difficult questions. But how can we start to build a sense of team? How can we build these relationships with the people around us in today's health and social care context?
I'm mindful of this bit of work done by a guy called Atul Gawande, who wrote the Checklist Manifesto. And he is a clinician, and so from the United States, and he's written a number of books.
He did the Reith lectures, didn't he?
Yes, he did indeed.
That's right.
About 2 years ago. But so what I like about the Checklist Manifesto is it's about outcome. So he starts by reminding us, he's talking about the complexity of tasks, complexity of jobs, and he uses two examples. One is about flying an aeroplane, and how the pilot, even though brilliantly trained, intensively, supervised, and not allowed to get into the jumbo jet before he's passed all sorts of things, still has to go through a checklist of activities, and there are other people who are involved in the checklist. The person, the navigator, co-pilot, the woman running the plane's housekeeping, I don't know all the different tasks, but anyway, he kind of runs through, he uses that as an example, and the other example, which I thought was fascinating, was putting up skyscrapers, and how the master builder is dead, so the idea that one person had all the brains to do the task no longer exists, and that actually to put up these extraordinary skyscrapers where the death rates of putting up these skyscrapers is incredibly low, and that's because of a very clever and skillful way of organising work amongst specialists who have to work together to get the skyscraper up, okay? And then he turns to a WHO piece of work that he was part of, which was looking at how do we improve the life expectancy of people coming out of surgical operations. And the piece of work was done across the world, and then they trialled the checklist they came up with, which is a set of routines, and where the hospitals in the United States and in Britain and in France were expected to not see any differences because they must be doing it right because they're all so clever and working so well, their death rates reduced. So their outcomes improved alongside, those in Nigeria and those in Kuala Lumpur and wherever else they went, I don't know. So what I think is really positive about that is that you've got a clinician who's setting out a method of team working supported by a routine. The responsibility for the checklist in the surgical setting is with the nurse, not with the doctor. So she is leading the process. That we've got a little example there of something that has been proven to work. The end of the book is sad because the end of the book says hospitals universally won't accept it. Some have, some won't. So
that's very good. I mean, it's actually parallel to the Virginia Mason experience, isn't it, from the States, which has been practised to some degree in the UK. It depends on the local enthusiasms. But from my experience in the Northeast, I know that there was a guy called Sir Peter Carr who was the chair of the NHS in the North East. And he was particularly keen on picking up these, particularly if you like to call them Japanese management experiences, and using them in the NHS. So they went and looked at Virginia Mason, and they brought the thing back. And the most
tell us what the thing is.
The thing is the checklist, exactly
Okay.
what you said.
Yeah.
So that in the operating theatre, there is a process. And the problem is we come back to this issue of the individual and the silo. Because I had personal experience of this in Peterborough, where I was chair of the hospital there, and we were given a lump of money under the last administration to deal with waiting time issues in orthopaedics, classic stuff. And we flew French surgeons in from Lille to operate at the weekends, because British surgeons wouldn't work at the weekends, and we kept the operating theatres going. I won't bore you with the negotiations we had to go through to get that point, but never mind, we got there. I went round and talked to the theatre staff after this had happened, and I said, well, what was your experience of this? Because it was the same theatre staff, but on different shifts during the week. Oh, he said, these surgeons worked as a team, you know. Really? I said, that's interesting. First of all, they said they could share a tray of instruments. We didn't have to go through CSSD, that's the whole autoclave process, with Mr. Jones's tray and Mr. Smith's tray. We had one set of instruments, so the turnover was much, much quicker. And actually, they didn't argue amongst themselves. They got on with it and worked as a team. Now, it's very interesting because the British surgeon has been brought up on a diet of somebody called Godber back in the 1950s. Who produced this philosophy that for the surgeon to operate, for the clinician to operate properly, they have to develop as an individual to become a consultant. That's the Valhalla. Got to get to that particular point. And they were trained as individuals, and therefore they had their own individual tray of instruments, they had their own individual approaches. And it was significantly different when we had those French surgeons in. They're not better surgeons,
just work differently.
but they worked differently, and they worked together, and they worked about a checklist.
So this is very interesting. Let's unpack this again, because one of the themes that's come up in a lot of these interviews has been, from a psychoanalytic perspective, this movement is about moving away from being a dysfunctional group to a group that is focused on the task. So what happens in most groups is, as soon as they're not functioning, no one even thinks about the task. That's all gone. It's all about survival and dealing with anxiety and getting one up over the anaesthetist or whatever it is. So one of the sort of really important contributions, I think, from a more sort of pragmatic management school is finding very sort of simple ways of putting the task into centre place. And so by having one set of tools, you're physically forcing people to focus on what tool is needed now, rather than where's my tools.
Exactly.
So that's a really sort of
It's
interesting sort of, you know, how these two worlds can actually facilitate something quite profound. But maybe this is also an issue which we're very interested in, about inclusivity and diversity within teams, because there's a very, again...
Oh yes, that comes into it.
Okay, so one of those sort of, Gittel is good, and Almo Metcalf, very interesting stuff about learning organisation. So another aspect of learning isn't just about people being able to say what they know and caring about each other enough. It's also about the importance of inclusion and diversity. We've got a big problem in the NHS of racism, for example, which is cutting out quite a significant percentage of people that actually work in the NHS. So again, maybe one of the sort of principles or the philosophy around team building is about inclusivity of teams.
Where I think this comes back to outcome, because there's a belief or not, so you can actually test it out, I think, by saying, well, what do you think? Do you think that different perspectives coming together to develop the single idea or the problem to the, the solution to the problem is better than having all the same people with the same ideas and the same perspectives coming up with it? And people say, no, of course it's good to have people with different ideas, different experiences, different, whatever. That's the best way with that kind of diversity, you get creativity, and therefore you're more likely to get a solution that works.
So we know this, don't we, when we're reading the management literature.
Yeah.
The problem, one of the problems with that, means that if you're going to be with a group of people that are different from you, is that you have to be able to tolerate not liking some of them or disagreeing with others, which is really where team working starts to sound a bit cynical, certainly in NHS settings. Of one of the key questions is, how do we get on with people that we actually work with rather than the people that we'd like to be working with or we find easy to work with?
Doesn't this come to another thing which I know is I'm hearing more and more in the last 10 years than I heard previously, is the notion of relationship development.
Yes.
So actually, we if it's all about I like you or I don't like you, and therefore that immediately limits whether or not I'm prepared to work with you or not. It's pretty barren ground, that, isn't it? Goodness me. And
how do I get past square one?
Absolutely, it's nothing to do with the task or the outcome of the task. But let's have this idea that actually the quality of work relates to the quality of relationships that we can put together here. So there's an activity there. We have to kind of be prepared to understand each other, because by understanding each other and seeing what kind of relationship I can develop with you, I'm then putting the practical pieces in place for problem solving or whatever.
You see, this is where I don't understand why you're not a psychoanalyst. We're in the Tavistock clinic. Where there is no argument here, it's all relational. I need you, you need me. So the question is, how can we communicate that in a way that doesn't destroy us?
And interesting, one of the models or frameworks that I've used a lot and I really like was developed by a guy called Bill Critchley and his colleague David Casey, and I'm going back to the 80s. In fact, I might be going to the late 70s, frankly.
It doesn't necessarily mean he's wrong.
No, it doesn't mean he's wrong, but I know that he's moved on actually, because he's much more interested in complex social relationships now. That's where he is. But just to, for a moment, focus on the work that he did however many years ago. He has the model he developed is quite simply, the more difficult the problem, the better, the more sophisticated the skills, the interpersonal skills have to be between the people in the group.
Yes.
So if you're trying to sort a problem out that has got a solution, you just need to kind of be able to have enough interpersonal skill that you work out who's got what bits of knowledge, plonk it on the table, bingo, we've sorted it. If you're sorting out a problem for which there is no solution, but actually it's about a series of expertises and ideas creatively coming together with some judgment and plonking on, we'll go for that one, actually the interpersonal skills that exist between the group have got to be much higher standard quality, sophistication.
So let's think about those. Gosh, this is very interesting. Let's think about those skills. What do we need to be able to get on with the people around us?
Great
assuming
question.
that it's very difficult.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and it's very embarrassing, because you say, the first one is listening.
Do you say you look like a teenager?
Well, no, because I think
it's
basic.
So fundamental.
It's so fundamental. It's it should. That's the wrong word. It is the first sort of step, I think, of management training is listening. Exquisite listening. Let's have a go at that. And it opens up people's minds.
But people have always known this. It's like, I come from the construction industry originally. I'm a civil engineer, and I always remember the banter that went on, his mouth is worn out, but his ears are in perfect working order, and that sort of thing to illustrate that people just don't listen, No. It's quite incredible, really. But those fundamental lessons get lost, because part of this is this cult of individualism, and I have got to put myself across. So you get into conversations in a team where, just like your classic politician on Newsnight, they're not actually listening to what the question is. They want to actually put forward their three particular points. That's the way they've been trained, and that's the way they're going. So that in the team, you've got people sort of sitting on the edge of their seat, waiting to interject, and they're not really interested in taking in anything else, because that's not what they've been taught is the way to fame and glory, is it? And that's So I think we've lost a lot in without reflection.
Yes. Well, I was going to go to a sort of a much more prosaic example, actually, which is that over the weekend was talking to a young lad who is a recent graduate and is looking for Christmas work.
Right.
And one of the places that he's gone looking is John Lewis. And he sent in an online application and all the rest of it. He said the interview was a very limited affair, the interview for John Lewis Christmas work. They had invested in a group activity where all the candidates on this particular round are asked to do a task together. And when asked why that was the centrepiece of the Christmas work recruitment process, the answer is teamwork. We need you to be able to be the sort of person that can work with other people. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I've heard it. I've heard that kind of thing. I mean, it's standard technique in graduate recruitment for graduate programs or management recruitment. But for Christmas work, I've never heard that before.
But then the rationale is very clear.
Absolutely,
the rationale is clear. But I mean, it really does. It brings us back to how these philosophies and principles are really, really important, because you can also be very cynical about that and say, what are the chances of us actually being able to do anything together in that kind of context? You know, that's quite hard to imagine how that's possible to do it. I mean, it's very lovely to emphasise team building, but often, you know, if you're working in the NHS now and you're being forced to go on a team building workshop, you just feel. But
that's because
it can be very cynical.
Because it's not related to purpose anymore.
Exactly,
It's
because it's not connected to these other things.
2 years ago, I did a survey for UCLH because they wanted to compare their process of patient experience, patient feedback, and what they do with the feedback with what industry does. So I talked to 13 different companies. And one of them I remember very clearly, and it was a Mercedes-Benz dealership that dealt with the big trucks. And on Friday night, one of their big customers came and said, we've got a problem. We've got several trucks out of commission and we've got to have them running by Monday morning. And the guy running the team got his guys together and said, look, we've got this problem. What are we going to do? He didn't direct anybody, and he just allowed them to debate it. And then they came up, well, I could do Saturday afternoon, I could do this, I could do that. Problem solved. Now, when I related that in UCLH, I said, well, it would go back to the rotors. What was on the rotor, you know? And it was, you know, there wasn't that determination about it. Do you see what I mean?
I do,
in that?
yeah. Because, this is where we have to mention the L word, I'm afraid, because there is something about team development which is directly relates to what is the leadership offered for that team development.
That was such a relief. Sure. I didn't know what the L word was.
I can see.
But it's you know, so I'm thinking of, you know, the times, actually, what do you want of your leadership here? You want your leadership to support a particular type of working within your work group, and how are they going to support it? You know, in your example, you know, the way that person, the leader, set out the task was, you know, handing out openly, you know, giving out the kind of challenge and the power to, you know, come up with the good ideas, come up with the solutions, and then take responsibility for doing something about it.
That's right.
That's a particular kind of leadership. And
also, what's very important in the NHS is getting rid of this blame culture, because as soon as somebody gets victimised for pointing out that they or someone else made a mistake, then you lose any possibility.
Well, that's an atmospheric, and the atmosphere is created by things outside of those people, outside of those organisations. So whilst you have a philosophy that is a top-down philosophy that is seeking to find a blame or a problem or whatever, or a scapegoat, then that will trickle down, because that then becomes the culture.
That's right.
And the real problem we have there is it starts so high, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
because it starts with ministers terrified they're going to get pinned to the wall about failure in a hospital or something. And it's what led Alan Milburn to set up Foundation Trust in the first place, so that actually the Secretary of State didn't get pinned to the wall in the House of Commons about a particular problem. And then the
that
press
blame then gets further down the food chain, and then what are a minority of experiences, but how whistleblowers, for example, are treated become powerfully important stories in our cultures, and it becomes impossible for people to speak. So I think being explicit and honest about that culture is a massively important.
Well, we had this problem in Peterborough when I arrived there in 1996. There was a blame culture, and we deliberately turned that round into a learning culture because we said, sorry, mistakes happen, and we need to be honest about that, and then we need to actually say what can we learn from this experience, not who can we hang out to dry over it.